Hey students, welcome to week 15. It was really great to meet a few of you in week 13 when we had the comic event. We are starting our fourth and final unit of this class, which is the novel, and we are only going to be reading one novel. I hope that somewhere in your academic career you've read another kind of novel, but if you haven't, if you've never read a novel and this is your very first time, I hope that it lives up to your expectations. So today I'm just going to briefly sort of go over some things you should know about just the genre itself, some things about Toni Morrison, our author, and then we will start breaking down some things you need to know about Sula, some theme you need to keep in mind, and then some questions I want to sort of leave you with. So if you haven't already completed your Sula reading, I would definitely pause this video right now and go read through those first few pages. Well, I think in my book it's 66 pages, but up to chapter 1922. And the reason for that is there's so much to really unpack with this particular novel that I really just wanted to kind of throw you in there and to see what would happen, especially because you guys have really been reading a lot of very deep things. Short story, poetry, the Glass Menagerie, it's all really complex literature, and it all is infinitely more deep than one would initially think, and certainly Sula is that way too. It's a fantastic piece of literature. So, all right, the novel itself. So a novel is just a long work of fiction, kind of just depending on size, really. There's something called a novella, which really just means the little novel, and those would be stories maybe, you know, of somewhere between, I don't know, fewer than 100 pages maybe. Usually novels are a couple hundred pages. They usually tell complex stories, sometimes multiple stories, about one character, maybe multiple characters, a town maybe. Sometimes the novel centers on an event. Sometimes the novel is an epic novel where it takes place over a really long period of time. There are certainly great examples of novels that take place over the period of a few hours. I can think of one that takes place in one night. But the novel essentially is going to use those elements of craft that we discussed in fiction. So be thinking about those kinds of things, like setting, like structure, like dramatic arc, like character, symbol. All of those kinds of things are going to be at play here as we dissect Sula. The dramatic arc. So in a novel, usually a contemporary novel, is going to begin medias res, which means in the middle of things, right? So we just are kind of dropped into a town in this case, and we are just starting at the beginning of, not necessarily of time, but we're just sort of starting at this moment in time. It usually has an inciting incident near the beginning of a novel. A lot of contemporary novels will actually have an inciting incident first or second sentence, or it'll usually be implied there. As the novel continues on, you're going to start to see the conflicts unfold, and often the way that I tell my creative writing students about how to picture a novel is that there are many knots that are being wound in the beginning half of a novel. So these knots are getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and then the sort of second half of the novel, or the back half of the novel, is really about unwinding those knots and solving those conflicts. In a novel, there might be multiple climaxes, again, just kind of depending on the structure of the story or stories itself. There might be multiple moments in time where characters are confronted with pretty big conflicts and they actually have to solve them. By the end of the book, we will establish a new normal, just like we do in short story, so be on the lookout for that in 2 weeks when we actually finish this novel. So with regard to that, I just want to touch on some themes. Again, that's kind of the big thing I want you to get out of reading literature, right? That themes are available in a novel just as they are in any piece of literature, really. So we are looking for, what is this story trying to tell the reader? What is the message? What's the central idea here? And sometimes in a novel, they can be hard to know what exactly to look for, which is why people often read novels again and again. Certainly this is probably my 12th or 13th time reading Sula. I was just reading it this morning, and I was picking up on so many things that I have maybe forgotten or missed the first couple of times. I don't think most of you have the time to actually read this novel multiple times before your final assignment will be due on it. Therefore, a lot of what I'm going to point out today are some of the things I want you to be watching out for. So this is just, I'm almost kind of giving you the things I want you to look for. As you come across them, you can sort of jot them down in your notes about what you think the theme of the book is. Symbols, again, we want to pay attention for those things in fiction, so look for colors, particularly in these pages. I can think of the color yellow. When Helene goes home to New Orleans to see her grandmother buried, her mother Rochelle is wearing yellow, and Helene later, or was it earlier, Nell notices her mother's skin almost looks very yellow, and so those colors are informing Nell of what to think about these women. It's no accident that Helene and Rochelle are both seen by Nell, particularly in that yellow symbol. Be aware of weather, natural elements, certainly the river, right? We've talked about bodies of water before. They give life, they take life. We are going to see that in these pages. Again, you've already read it, so this is definitely a spoiler lecture. So if you have not read your Sula pages, pause right now, go read, and then come back to this. If you see images that are sort of repeated here in the book, note that, right? Maybe even just star it in your book and come back and figure out what it means later, right? But certainly Toni Morrison is definitely a writer who is working on all of these levels, and so it's really important just to kind of pay attention to that, especially because sometimes her prose isn't always as clear. She's very much a poetic kind of writer. And so some of her sentences read like poetry, and you kind of have to unpack, well, what does that sentence mean and how does that image connect? If you have repeated images, for instance, of Shadrach and his hands growing and being monstrous in size, what does that actually sort of say? What might that mean? Is he a monster? Are his hands something other than what he is? Is he responsible for that? Also pay attention for literary allusions, right? Particularly biblical allusions in this book. You're going to get a lot of those, sometimes in just a name, sometimes in a biblical story. So again, it just kind of depends, but I want you paying attention for those things. Also with character, remember, here's a great picture of, if you've never seen Beloved, this was actually a novel that was written by Toni Morrison, and then later Oprah Winfrey starred in the movie version, but that's a fantastic novel as well. But remember, our characters in these novels are really complex characters, right? They have flaws, they have fears, they have desires, and for every single character, I want you to be asking, what do they want? What is it that they want? And there are two kinds of wants I'll define here, right? There's the external. So sometimes that's just as simple as, does a character want to go somewhere? Are the girls going to get ice cream, right? Is that just a very simple want that they can sort of access externally? But internally, characters have drive, right? Are they after something more? Do they want, attention? Do they want love? Do they want acceptance? So as you are reading and gathering information and watching these characters interact with each other, I want you to be asking yourself, okay, well, what is it about them? What is Sula's tragic flaw? That's something you should actively be looking for as you are reading about her. So let's talk about Toni Morrison herself. Arguably, I think the one of the absolute greatest American novelists of our time. She's incredibly prolific. She writes of the world that she knew growing up in Ohio in the 1930s. She graduated from Howard University, very, very prestigious historically black college. She got a BA in English. She studied the classics. She studied Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner at Cornell. She got her master's degree. She actually went back to Howard University and she was a professor there. So really just like an accomplished academic in her own right. Toni Morrison in interviews has said things that she wrote her very first novel, which was The Bluest Eye, and she wrote that because there wasn't a novel like that out there, and she wanted to read something like that. And because there wasn't anything out there and she wanted to read something about her history or her people, she just decided to sit down and write it. And she was in her late 30s, early 40s when that got published. And ever since then, she has just been on a tear of writing amazing literature. As you can see here, she's won the Pulitzer, she's won the Nobel Prize, she's won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So just a master of craft. We are reading her second novel, which again is incredibly powerful and I think arguably one of her greatest works here. So with Sula, so much you need to know. But I want you to pay attention for a second to this green line in the middle of the screen. I was trying to come up with what I thought maybe the dramatic arc of the novel might be. And because the novel sort of starts with this historical point of view, where we get kind of an explanation about the setting and where we are, I wanted to include that here down where you see setting right here. This is important. It helps us understand not only what time period we're living in, where we're living, right? How that land was acquired, and how in the future that land actually becomes desirable and the white people want that land back. And ultimately make a golf course out of it. Now we are going to see a slice of time when the bottom, which is up in the hills, right? When the bottom is inhabited by the Black community. And think about 1919 here. We had just gotten out of, or getting out of just got out of World War I. This is Jim Crow era, definitely. So you had segregation all over the place, and you see that when Helene takes her daughter Nell on the train, right, and they accidentally get onto the wrong car, and the conductor basically has zero tolerance for that. This was the kind of world that people are living in, and certainly it's a lot more destructive and heinous, and there was a lot of lynching of Black people at the time. So again, this is the backdrop for what you need to know going into this. Once we kind of get that setting, we're introduced to Shadrach, and as you come across characters like this, where we spend a small chapter talking about him, I want you to jot down the things that you learn about this particular character. And you can see that I've started to make a list here. So he is the founder of National Suicide Day. He was a World War I veteran who was wounded, not only physically, but what we might call PTSD. Remember, he's in the waiting room and his hands keep growing and he's terrified and he doesn't know. He has no idea why they're calling him private. In fact, he's so disoriented and out of it that he's actually booked on charges of being publicly intoxicated. Anyhow, when he goes back into the community of Bottom, even though National Suicide Day seems kind of out there, the townspeople don't really consider it a terrible thing or like a way of discarding him. Shadrach still belongs to the community. And so I want to point you to this top of page, in my book, it's page 15. They knew Shadrach was crazy, but that did not mean he did not have any sense, or even more important, that he had no power. So again, this is really important to understand who he is, because he's going to observe and report back, and he is going to be a way of marking time throughout the novel. Once we finish that Shadrach section, as you know, we get to Helene. And again, I would write down everything you sort of know about her, because the community and the history inform the story of Sula Peace and her best friend Nell. The majority of the novel actually is about Sula and Nell, but we aren't introduced to Sula until page 30. But again, all of this other historical information sort of informs us about the girls. So again, you can see I started to make a list here. And then from the Helene section, we learn about Nell. I think it's really important. I put daughter of Nell right. Daughter of Helene. But Nell had a nose that her mother hated. And you're going to constantly see Helene, right, tell Nell to pull on her nose. She's actually trying to get her daughter to change her appearance. She thinks that by pulling on her nose enough that Nell could somehow become more beautiful. Nell is very obedient. Her mother is a very sort of fastidious kind of woman. She's very orderly, very respected in her community, and Nell, because of that, is a very sort of obedient girl. And she's deeply lonely as well. We see her sitting on the couch prior to having that friend in Sula, and it's really kind of sad because she's so deeply isolated, and she's really desperate for that sisterhood that she forms with Sula. An important point to note here about Nell is that sense of meanness that she gains from that trip to New Orleans. This highly influences how Nell sees her mother and her grandmother, so sort of her history, and it also sort of launches Nell on a quest to figure out who she is and who she wants to be. And so we see a slight rebellion against her mother when she befriends Sula. In the next chapter of 1921, we're introduced to Ava, who is a very interesting character and will be with us for a while over the next few pages here. But Ava is, again, think about biblical names as well. She's married to Boy Boy. She mothers 3 children, Hannah, Pearl, and Plum. And she's a grandmother to Sula, as you know. I think that story of the one leg is really interesting because certainly she's incredibly desperate, trying to feed her 3 children all on her own, and basically ends up leaving them. And 18 months later, she's swept down from a wagon with 2 crutches, a new black pocketbook, and 1 leg. And there's those rumors that fly around the community about, well, how did she do that? How did she get that money? How did she, come back and was ready to sort of set herself up? And so, again, whether or not you believe the railroad story or there, other ways of getting that money, this sort of informs the kind of woman that we know about Ava, right? She's going to do what she absolutely has to do in order to see that her and her children survive. We also see that incredibly visceral scene with her and Plum when the little baby is constipated, and there's literally nothing else she can do other than to take the last bit of food and put it up his rectum in order to get him to go to the bathroom. And a really desperate scene, but again, it shows you the kind of care that she takes in her children and making sure that they are at least provided for. Cared for might be a different kind of word. She does take in children from around the community as well. So we meet the Deweys. She takes in Tar Baby. Certainly Plum comes back. And let's see here. Then we're introduced over to Sula. And some things to note about Sula is that this home is very chaotic for a young girl to grow up in. I think it's also important to note that Hannah really loves men, and has them all over the house all the time. Again, Sula's a young, impressionable girl at the time, so this kind of informs how she feels about men. There is a birthmark over her eye, and it's important to note these kind of things. Again, reference to biblical times, right? You have this idea of the mark of the beast, so people with those kind of marks sometimes are viewed as evil, right? Certainly with this idea of the image of it being a stemmed rose, right? You can think about a symbol here. Is this a symbol of beauty? Sula certainly seems to have a much more fiery personality than Nell. When those boys are tormenting the young girls, when Sula, let's see, I think this is in 1922, holding the knife in her right hand, she pulled the slate toward her and pressed her left forefinger down hard on its edge. Her aim was determined but inaccurate. She slashed off only the tip of her finger. The 4 boys stared open-mouthed at the wound and scrap of flesh, like a button mushroom, curling in the cherry blood that ran into the corners of the slate, right? And Sula looks right at these boys and she tells them, if I can do that to myself, what do you suppose I'll do to you? So she is incredibly fierce, definitely trying to defend her and Nell, and it seems to work for the time being. So again, I would note those kind of extraordinary moments. One of the major themes that I want you to pay attention for is good versus evil. In this book, it's incredibly messy though, and so you're not always necessarily going to know who's good and who is evil. But I think part of the larger thing that the book is getting after is maybe the complexity of that, or how both of those things kind of work together. If we think about Shadrach, whether or not he is a character we can be sympathetic to, certainly as a wounded war veteran, we can see him with sympathy. We can feel like, oh my gosh, what a terrible thing. Here he is in this hospital bed. He doesn't know what he's doing, why his hands are growing. And then when we see him marching up and down the street, calling for people to kill themselves or kill each other, it feels a little bit more like, oh, okay, so is that sympathy, or are we bothered by that as readers? And so again, I think Morrison is trying to ask us, you know, how we might define that or feel. When I think about Helene, and I'm gonna, this again, these page references are in my book. And so this is the moment where Helene takes Nell back to New Orleans to see her grandmother, and she arrives at the door, weary from travel and from having been really treated like animals, not allowed to use the bathroom. Remember, she has to use the leaves in the field, essentially. And she arrives at her grandmother's door only to miss seeing her grandmother. And yet she is so cold to her own mother, Rochelle. And so again, it's not necessarily kind of black and white in terms of, okay, how does that paint Helene? Is she the good one? Is she the evil one? But I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Here, her grandmother was a prostitute. Her mother certainly seems to be, has that same profession, and yet Helene adores her grandmother, or at least reveres her enough to travel all that way to see her pass, and really just despises her own mother. With Ava, particularly with that scene with Plum, this is far more complex than the Helene example here, but we see Plum is doing what I would assume is heroin, and Ava goes to visit her son, who's just seems very strung out in his own bed, and Plum says, "Hey man, hey, you holding me, mama?" His voice was drowsy and amused. He chuckled as though he had heard some private joke. Ava held him closer and began to rock. Back and forth she rocked him, her eyes wandering around the room. There in the corner was a half-eaten store-bought cherry pie. balled up candy wrappers, and empty pop bottles peeped from under the dresser. On the floor by her foot was a glass of strawberry crush and a Liberty magazine, rocking, listening to Plum's occasional chuckles. Ava let her memory spin, loop, and fall. Plum in the tub that time as she leaned over him. He reached up and dribbled water into her bosom and laughed. She was angry, but not too, and laughed with him. And so here we see this really sort of touching moment where, as a grown man, Ava is holding Plum, she's comforting him, he's kind of out of his mind on drugs, she's reminiscing back to caring for him as a young child, which, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, when she had to sort of do a desperate act in order to make sure that he, survived impacted bowels. So we see both here the mother who cares deeply for him, and then a woman who douses him in kerosene and lights him on fire. And so one of my large questions here is to ask you, if you find her guilty. Is she saving him? Is this an act of mercy? Is she sort of saying like, well, you're never going to do better than this moment right here, so I'm going to have mercy on you and take you out of this world? Is this evil? Is it a little bit of both? And then the last example I want to point to here is with Sula. And so the girls have just danced around with Chicken Little, well, Sula did, and let him go into the river, and Chicken Little sank in the river, and the girls are sort of terrified that somebody saw something that happened. And so Sula goes running into Shadrach's house. And so again, I would ask you here, is this intentional? If they're trying to cover up as opposed to asking for help or letting other adults know, are they culpable in Chicken Little's murder? Are they too young to know better? And so what would you say? Is this an evil moment? Is this just a stupid moment? Are they just too young and too immature? Or how would you essentially sort of judge them? And this is going to be a big thing for reading this novel. How do you define these characters in terms of morality? In fact, the large question that I'll be getting at the end of the semester with your very final project is really how you feel about Sula in terms of morality, right? Is she, a morally corrupt character? Is she amoral, right? What is she? So I constantly want you to be questioning everything. Why do the characters make the choices that they make? Do the girls actually love each other? Do they just need each other? How far are they willing to go to protect each other? Maybe it's just a moment in childhood, right? So I just want to share with you a few quotes that I found really important to me, not only to theme, but to understanding what's happening in the book here. So the first one up here says, she had been frightened of the soldier's eyes on the train, the black wreath on the door, the custard pudding she believed lurked under her mother's heavy dress, the feel of unknown streets and unknown people. So this is when Nell is on the train with her mother, this is when she's actually back home from the trip in New Orleans, and she's thinking about all of those things along the trip that had sort of frightened her. And this kind of self-awareness helps us to understand not only how Nell decides to go against her mother's wishes and get a friend like Sula, who comes from this very chaotic house, but it also helps us understand the things that terrify Nell and ultimately will play into who she becomes as an adult. Second quote here, this is when Sula happens to be running into the house, and Hannah, Sula's mother, is talking to some other ladies, and Hannah says, "Sure you do. You love her, like I love Sula. I just don't like her. That's the difference." And so I were to ask you here, if you heard someone like your parent say that they loved you but they didn't like you, how would that influence you, especially as a young child? Does that change how you feel about yourself, or how you think that person might feel about you? This certainly, I think, plays on Sula and some of the choices that she makes. So note that quote there. Here's another one. Again, when the girls are on the riverbank, they're playing. Notice too on my page 59, when the girls are actually digging in the dirt with sticks, this is foreshadowing that death, right? They're actually digging what's called a grave. Carefully, they replaced the soil and covered the entire grave with uprooted grass, right? So pay attention for words like that that kind of tip us off, right? The murder is coming on the next page, right? So Sula picked him up by his hands and swung him around, outward, then around and around. His knickers ballooned, and his shrieks of frightened joy startled the birds and the fat grasshoppers. When he slipped from her hands and sailed away over the water, they could still hear his bubbly laughter. Nell spoke first. I'm jumping ahead just a little bit. Somebody saw. A figure briefly appeared on the opposite shore, right? So again, I would ask you, if they are worried here, not about Chicken Little, but about being caught, what does that say about Nell and Sula? Is this entirely Sula's fault? Is this Nell's fault? Should they have gone to Shadrach for help? Could he have helped? What does it mean when Shadrach says always? Does he mean to say that he always knows, that he does know? Here at the funeral, Nell and Sula did not touch hands or look at each other during the funeral. There was a space, a separateness between them, right? So again, I want to ask you, do you think that that separateness is guilt? Is this shame? Is this actually grief that is sitting between them? Now that these two best friends have this incredible secret between them, is this going to tear them apart? How is this going to reflect on the rest of their lives, essentially? And then the last paragraph, or part of the paragraph that I assigned in these pages, says, let's see, they held hands and knew that only the coffin would lie in the earth. The bubbly laughter and the press of fingers in the palm would stay above ground forever. So think about that image. Ooh, excuse me. Think about that image right there, that they would stay above ground. Oh, stay above ground forever, right? This idea that those kind of secrets just never go away. At first, as they stood there, their hands were clenched together. They relaxed slowly until during the walk back home, their fingers were laced in as gentle as a clasp as any of the two young girlfriends trotting up the road on a summer day, wondering what happened to butterflies in the winter. So again, if we're thinking about symbols here, we have an end of childhood, right? Winter is often the end of something, right? The girls are sort of wondering what happened to the butterflies, but in a larger sense, it's metaphorical. The death of Chicken Little has caused them for childhood to be over, essentially. And so as we move into 1923, the girls are no longer sort of children. They are carrying a big, heavy adult burden with them. Alrighty. For your discussion board this week, I do want to point out that because of the holiday of Thanksgiving, your discussion board post and your quiz will not be due until Friday of this week. If you can get it done sooner, that's absolutely fine. But I figured many of you are probably going to be eating and enjoying with your family on Thursday, so I was going to make sure that I extended that deadline. Your discussion board responses are still due by Saturday, so make sure that you don't have a lot of time between the two, so make sure you still get those done. I am asking you this week about the two murders, Plum and Chicken Little, and who do you think is responsible and why? Are these malicious acts? Are these on accident? How do you sort of break down guilt and culpability between all of these characters? All right, y'all. So I will see you on the discussion board. Thanks for turning in your drama essays. I will be grading those furiously this week and next week to get those back to you as soon as possible. Of course, if you have any questions or concerns, make sure you email me or call me or stop by my office hours. Take care.